are watching the multi-awarded Radio Bandido TV on channel 224 Sky Cable and TV Plus boxes. Simulcast on DZRJ 8:10 a.m. Informing, advising, and entertaining the Filipinos and OFWs around the world. Streaming live on www.facebook.com/DZRJ 8:10 a.m. or on YouTube, channel DZRJ 8:10 a.m. Radio Bandido.
The views and comments of the hosts and guests are not necessarily those of the station.
Hello, Philippines, and welcome to the World News Jam right here on DZRJ and Radio Bandito TV. My name is Lecain. We bring you the top news stories from around the world, coming to you live from the beautiful city of Makati. Now, today we will be discussing some very interesting topics, such as the ever-changing tariffs. Can you guess what tomorrow will bring and what the new meaning of the word taco is? Also, will we ever stop asking if China will invade Taiwan? Only when China says it will not invade Taiwan, which is not going to be this week. What's going on with Elon Musk? He came into the White House not so well liked, and now he's leaving the White House and he's even less liked. Did you ever want to go to Harvard? It's hard now, especially even harder if you're not from the U.S. And taking a look at DNA testing and how much the government should know about our genetics. But before we get to the news, does anyone remember Hot Lips Houlihan? She was the nurse on the TV show MASH back in the 70s. Actually, her name on the show was Margaret, but everyone called her Hot Lips because, well, we all used to sit around the TV and watch that show. It was funny and entertaining. It was the one show that everyone watched. Hot Lips was a feisty nurse that couldn't understand why no one would ever follow the rules. She was brash and yelled a lot, but inside she just wanted people to like her. She was played by the actress 𝗪cie𝗪𝗪. She was really born for that role and played it perfectly. She died the other day at the age of 87, just from being old. Her MASH co-star Alan Alda remembered her on X, writing, "Loretta was a supremely talented actor. She deserved all her 10 Emmy nominations with her 2 wins. But more than acting her part, she created it. She worked hard in showing the writing staff how it could turn the character from a joke, sexist stereotype to a real person with real feelings and ambitions. We celebrated the day the script came out, listing her character as not Hot Lips, but as Margaret. Hot Lips, or Margaret, for the most part, was the villain on the show. But then one episode where she was yelling at the nurses and in the middle breaks down, saying that all she ever wanted was for once somebody to offer her a cup of coffee. Made us all take a look at ourselves and how maybe we don't see what's really inside a person. The last episode of MASH was the most watched TV show in U.S. history. I remember because they said the water companies recorded the most water ever used in a 5-minute period. That was at the commercial break when everyone went to the bathroom at the same time across America. The very end, on the last episode, Hawkeye kissed Margaret. Everyone across the U.S. cried. 𝗪cie𝗪𝗪, dead at 87 years old. And this is Lecain on the World News Jam. We're talking about interesting stories going on around the world. So, what is a taco and how does it relate to the Trump tariffs? First, a taco is a nice Mexican sandwich. It has a crunchy shell on the outside and ground beef and lettuce tomato on the inside. But as far as the Trump tariff, it's a new term coined by a Financial Times columnist. It's just a way to describe Trump's tariffs. Basically, it stands for Trump always chickens out. You see, he's made multiple tariffs on many countries, but have you noticed that when the tariff is only a few days old before Trump then decides to pause them? He first said he paused, and in the middle of the pause, he made another pause. And then they went up a little higher, and then he paused again. Last week, he shocked everyone when he upped the EU tariffs to 50%, and now the EU people were like, wait a minute, you just paused the tariffs before. You can't make a new tariff in the middle of the pause. What about the pause? Well, Trump wasn't satisfied with the speed of how things were going, so in the middle of the EU, he paused, jacked up the price. But then on Tuesday, he paused that tariff. And now there's a pause within the pause. Now, Europe doesn't seem so mad. They have some of their own acronyms now, such as MAGA, Make America Go Away, and MEGA, Make Europe Great Again. But let's move over to the China tariffs. Trump upped those China tariffs to 145%. So China turned around and did the same thing. You know what Trump did? He paused the tariffs on China, and they both decided to call a truce. But then Trump accused China of violating the truce. Trump said that China has totally violated the agreement with us. Of course, the Chinese said it's actually the U.S. that needs to, I quote, cease discriminatory restrictions against China. So, on Friday, Trump laid it all out. He said he has imposed devastating tariffs on China, so he made a fast deal to save them from what he thought was going to be a very bad situation. Trump said everybody was happy that this is good news. The bad news is that China, perhaps not surprisingly to some, has totally violated its agreement with us. So much for being Mr. Nice Guy. End quote. Well, this had everyone a bit puzzled. But as best people could figure, Trump is unhappy about the speed at which China is moving. Something about some U.S. companies being put on a blacklist, restricting exports of rare earth magnets. That's a critical component of cars, aircraft, and semiconductors. An official said the United States did exactly what it was supposed to do, and the Chinese are slow rolling their compliance, which is completely unacceptable and has to be addressed. To which China said the U.S. must immediately correct its erroneous actions, cease discriminatory restrictions against China, and jointly uphold the consensus reached at the high-level talks in Geneva. Geneva, that's the place where they agreed on the truce. But since then, talks between the two countries have, well, stalled a bit. You know, Trump is now going to do what he does best. He's going to threaten them with something else. And he did. Just this past week, Trump administration is moving on revoking visas of some 280,000 students. I mean, they could even start revoking work visas, at which point I guess China would do the same. But in the middle of all this, the Court of International Trade ruled that Trump actually can't do any of these tariffs. I never even heard of the Court of International Trade. That the basis for his tariffs of using an economic emergency law, the court deemed that there's no emergency. In fact, before Trump came into office, the country was actually doing pretty okay. So they blocked his tariffs. So what did Trump do? Trump did what Trump does best. He appealed the court order, and now we're back to the beginning. But can you imagine another country and, Trump was blocked by his own court? And now they're having to negotiate with those countries. Who wants to be the person to negotiate with China? China knows the courts have ruled against Trump in the court, and they also know what a taco is. And this is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam right here on DZRJ and Radio Bandito TV. All right, I need to get to this. The question many of us have asked here in the Philippines: is China going to invade Taiwan, and when? As we know, President Xi of China has ordered his military to be ready for a full-scale invasion by 2027. So this week, in walks 𝗡𝗲𝗄𝘀, the U.S. Defense Secretary. Some of the U.S. might have called him a bit of a joke. Many still can't believe that a Fox morning talk show host is now in charge of the most powerful military in the world. But here we are. So this week, he decided to speak out about China and Taiwan. Now, since China and the U.S. are not so fond of each other right now because of the trade war, it might not seem like such a good time to, poke the panda. But here we go. He said that the U.S. does not seek to dominate or strangle China, but the U.S. won't be pushed out of Asia by the Chinese. Of course, China said that Asia is just fine without the U.S. around. In fact, the biggest troublemaker currently in Asia is the United States. But 𝗪𝗀𝗃 called China a hegemonic power. Now, I have to admit that's the first time I've ever used the word hegemonic. It means to have authority over others. He goes on that China hopes to dominate and control too many parts of Asia. He said Beijing was credibly preparing to potentially use military force to alter the balance of power in Asia. Referred to that 2027 deadline that President Xi Jinping has allegedly put on the Chinese military to be capable of invading Taiwan. He said China is building the military it needed to do it, for training for it every day, rehearsing, getting ready for the real deal. Then came the quasi-threat. He said, "Let me be clear. Any attempt by the communist Chinese to conquer Taiwan by force would result in devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world." There's no reason to sugarcoat it, he said. The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent. We hope not, but it certainly could be. He went on that the U.S. does not seek war or conflict with China, and the U.S. does not want to dominate or, as I said, strangle China. That the U.S. does not seek a regime change, only that China cannot dominate the U.S. or its allies, that the United States will not be pushed out of the region, and that's that. Well, as you can imagine, after 𝗪𝗀𝗃 made this statement, China responded that the speech of 𝗪𝗀𝗃 was steeped in provocations and instigation. China always has a great vocabulary. And that 𝗪𝗀𝗃 repeatedly smeared and attacked China and relentlessly played up the so-called China threat. And then they went on that the U.S. is the biggest troublemaker in Asia. And then went on to describe the offensive weapons that the U.S. is deploying in the South China Sea, etc., etc. By the way, the U.S. sent its largest delegation ever to this dialogue meeting, while China just sent a few lower-level team and then backed out of its speech at the last minute without a reason. So 𝗪𝗃𝗃 took this time to talk to some at that meeting about wrapping arms around our friends and finding new ways to work together. But he stressed that even though he wants to help, and here it comes, this type of defense doesn't come cheap. He urged Asian countries to think about upping their defense spending. He called this tough love, but love nonetheless. He said, how can it make sense for countries in Europe to do it while the key allies and partners in Asia spend less and face a more formidable threat? Europe is stepping up, he said. U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific can too, and should, followed by quickly upgrading their own defenses, saying they should be partners, not dependents on the U.S. He then talked about any country wanting to seek ties with China, and he kind of made this kind of warning. He said, China would use this as leverage and would complicate things for the United States, and that the U.S. doesn't seek to have permanent enemies, that the U.S. is not interested in moralistic and a preachy approach to foreign policies of the past. We are not here to preach to you about climate change or cultural issues, that the U.S. will not impose its will on you. Anyway, I guess that makes sense. The U.S. is no longer supports climate change at all, and obviously does not care about cultural issues. So, what is it that the U.S. wants in the Indo-Pacific? Well, for one thing, it needs to keep that alliance with Taiwan. Taiwan may actually be a huge key to the U.S.'s future. Some might say that he who controls the microchip controls the world. Right now, Taiwan controls that part of the world. What would it mean if it fell into the hands of China? China knows that if Taiwan were back, if it was back in their hands, its dominance to the tech world would be absolutely unmatched. That it would have a hold over the U.S. like never before. And finally, it can control the shipping lanes in the South Pacific. So is that the goal? Is that what the U.S. is trying so desperately to stop in the Indo-Pacific? So the question is posed, what if China goes all out, against the odds, tries to take Taiwan? Would it be like Russia and the Ukraine, in which a tiny country is able to hold off its giant military power because of the weapons the U.S. gives them? But the U.S. is on the sidelines of the Ukrainian war. They just give Ukrainians stuff. They don't actually fight. Hegseth said today that if China goes after Taiwan, there would be devastating consequences. And here lies the dilemma. How much of what Hegseth says is real, and how much of it is just trying to sound real? What would the U.S. do in order to protect Taiwan? Of course, the Philippines would be obliged to fight alongside the U.S., that is, if it went to war. And of course, there's an even bigger question. If China makes a play for Taiwan in 2027, while Trump is still in office, well, we can pretty much guess what other presidents would do. But Trump, that's a much harder thing to guess. Would he stand and fight? Or would he do a taco? Trump always chickens out. Anyway, hopefully we won't need to find out anytime soon. And this is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on Radio Bandito TV. Talking about stories going on around the world. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, I'm not sure if this means much, but the ceasefire to Israel is kind of back on the table. Hamas has responded to a U.S. ceasefire plan put forth by the U.S. Hamas said in a statement that its new responding proposal aims to achieve a permanent ceasefire, a comprehensive withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and ensure the flow of aid to the people of the Gaza Strip. As part of the agreement, 10 living Israeli prisoners held by the resistance will be released. They will also return 18 dead bodies in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. The senior U.S. Official there, his assurance is that the permanent ceasefire will continue and not more fighting after the pause is complete. Now, let me just get this straight. So Hamas is saying, in their three-pronged approach to the mediators, asking the U.S. for assurances that this ceasefire will be permanent and that they won't fight anymore, and the U.S. will be assured of that. And the humanitarian assistance will be carried out by the United Nations, and of course, the Israeli military will completely pull out of Gaza. Okay. Seems like a decent demand, doesn't it? Except Israel will never do that. and even the U.S. called it totally unacceptable, that Hamas should accept the proposal that the U.S. has made without any changes. Of course, Hamas said the U.S. is being biased. Hamas said it had an understanding with the U.S., and the U.S. accepted their proposal for negotiation. Then they were presented with the Israeli response. It disagreed with every single provision. And the U.S. agreed, okay, this is unacceptable. The Hamas officials said, why is it that only the response of Israel can be negotiated? And the only one that we will negotiate is the one that Israel makes? He said this violates the integrity and fairness of mediation and constitutes bias toward the Palestinians. But of course, Israel has a different take on this, saying that Hamas just flat out rejected the U.S. proposal and made its own new one. The Prime Minister's office said Israel will continue its action for the return of our hostages and defeat of Hamas. And there you go. Every time it seems like there might be some headway near a ceasefire, this happens. In any case, what is it that the U.S. is actually asking from Hamas? The big one centers around the hostages. Hamas would need to release 10 Israeli hostages and return the remains of 18 deceased hostages. Now, in exchange for that, Israel would agree to release 125 Palestinian prisoners serving life sentences and free 1,111 Gazans who have been detained. There'd be a 60-day truce between the two sides and would immediately allow humanitarian aid to be brought into Gaza. But in this agreement, when the 60 days is over, what happens? If the negotiations are still going on, will there be an extension, or will Israel go back to bombing the people that it had just returned to home? Also, there was nothing in the agreement about a guarantee to end the war. If Hamas gives up the prisoners, will they get a guarantee from the U.S. that Israel won't kill them right away? But here's the thing. Right now, Israel is holding almost all the cards. Once they get back all the hostages, Hamas could be in some real trouble. There's nothing to stop them from killing every single Palestinian in Gaza. The only card Hamas can play is that the U.S. will agree to certain protections once the hostages are released. And that agreement must be ironclad. As of now, all Israel needs to do is wait. The people of Gaza are starving to death. The Israeli blockade has stopped nearly all humanitarian aid from coming in. The people of Gaza, of course, are getting desperate. Last week, they allowed a few trucks to come in. However, all the trucks coming in were looted right away. The trucks are stopped along the highway. People just take everything that's in them. The people are starving. At a distribution site, the people are getting killed in a fight. What little manages to get to them? Basically, when people see a food truck, they rush it. It's either steal the food or die. And that's it. That's what's going on there. It seems so simple to me to stop all this suffering. Why won't Hamas just sign the U.S. deal and the people would get food? Actually, Hamas remembers the last time they signed a ceasefire deal. Remember that? Back in March? They had a ceasefire and they were working out a deal, but Israel added provisions to that deal. They wanted a presence of the Israeli military in Gaza. They wanted Hamas left out of the government and a new government installed. Basically, they wanted things they already knew they could never get. So the second ceasefire time elapsed, and what did Israel do? They started bombing, stopped letting in the humanitarian aid. Hamas believes that this will just happen again because, according to many, the Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel does not want the war to end. He needs the war to continue in order to stay in power. Is this true? Well, many believe that it is. So Hamas won't sign off on the new ceasefire deal until they are assured Israel will not kill them the next time they walk out of their front door. But the U.S. says this is totally unacceptable, that Hamas should take the deal that's on the table. As of now, Israel agrees to the deal, but of course they do. Israel is very good at signing deals. The issue they have is keeping the deal that they sign. Israel seems to have one main goal: removing Hamas from the face of the earth. And Hamas knows this. So they were somewhat smart enough to see that signing this ceasefire, they would be basically signing their own death warrant. Hamas right now is looking for an opening, a way to get the humanitarian aid to Gaza and stay alive at the same time. But what will happen while they are trying to figure this mess out? Israel will continue to bomb anything that moves. Last Sunday, the Israeli military opened fire on Palestinians who had gathered at an aid distribution center that was run by a U.S.-backed group. 31 people died that day. Meanwhile, bombings continue on a daily basis. Now, just to be clear, these are civilians who are getting bombed. The pictures coming out of Gaza are getting harder and harder to look at. Children with the cheeks sucked in, of bony bodies with injuries from the bombs they see every day. It is a country in a humanitarian crisis. And all it needs to stop this horror is the signature of two people that will never trust each other and will never agree. Something you just have to shake your head at. And this is the World News Jam on DZRJ Radio and Facebook on DZRJ. I'm Eric Lecain. Well, we have been talking about Elon Musk for the last couple of months, the richest man in the world, the owner of Tesla, SpaceX, who's running Doge, part of the U.S. government designed to cut wasteful spending. Now, since he has been in the White House, he has been somewhat controversial. First, people thought that maybe actually he might be the real president, that he was the one deciding policy and basically telling Trump exactly what to do. Remember, Trump seems to always bow down to people with money. Example, Putin, the Prince of Saudi Arabia. But eventually, Trump needed to get everyone paying attention to him again, and Elon kind of fell out of the spotlight. But at the end of last week, Elon didn't fall out of the spotlight. He was out of the spotlight. He was out of the White House. Now, I know I said before that I didn't think Elon would last 100 days, but instead he has lasted 130 days. Trump does not play well with people who crave the spotlight, as Elon does. In the end, Trump wants the spotlight to be shown on just one person, and that is Donald Trump. Now, Musk had an interesting time in the White House. He pushed his way into many government offices. When I say pushed, I mean sometimes his people physically pushed their way into offices. His goal was to cut $2 trillion from the U.S. budget, to take away all the wasteful spending and fraud. But the problem Musk had was that there was not so much wasteful spending and not so much fraud, at least not as much as he thought. The U.S. had somewhat dealt with a lot of this decades ago and had filled positions based on what was really needed. But Elon was not going to let that stop him. So he went into the offices and he just fired everyone. I mean, he had to do something. The problem was that many of the people he fired were there for a reason. People that do medical research, the veterans, the people that oversee the nuclear arsenal, air traffic controllers, people that inspect products to make sure that they are safe for our children. But to get to that $2 trillion, Elon had to fire some people to get rid of the fraud and abuse of the system, even if there was no fraud and abuse. So they went in and they fired many, many people. Then they boasted about all the savings to the American people. But then they started to realize that many of those government workers they fired, well, they actually needed them. Some of them badly. On several occasions, they tried desperately to hire them back, but then they were having a hard time finding some of these people. They forgot to get their phone numbers. Remember, many of those people were fired via email, and then their emails were removed. But then Musk and his Doge team realized that the security of the country was in peril, or actually the safety of some Americans was now at risk. So they really went looking for those people and tried to hire all those people back. It was quite a bit of an embarrassment. It was at that point that Elon, who used to be somewhat looked up to by many, was now being coined a horribly mean person. That he was only interested in how much he could make off the White House. They had these Republican town halls, remember those? Where you talk to your congressperson or your senator. People were demanding that Musk be removed from his position. People were trying to destroy Tesla cars and damage the Tesla dealerships. Tesla, of course, being Elon's company. But it didn't stop there. People around the world were now trying to get rid of their Teslas, and no one would even dare buy them. Having a Tesla turned out to be a really bad thing. Before, Elon was a fairly admired person across the world. Then after working at the White House, he became one of the most hated people across the world. And then there was the salute. Remember that? He was giving a speech at one of those Trump events. Elon thought it would be best to give a Nazi-type salute to the crowd in a big build-up at the second inauguration event. Elon got up on stage, started dancing around, waving his hands in the air. But then he stopped, like he was at attention. He put his fist on his heart, and he straightened out his arm as if to say, Heil. To make things worse, more dramatic, and make sure everyone saw it, well, he did it again, in the other direction. Then he said, my heart goes out to you. Now, I'm not exactly sure what he meant by that, but in general, that's something you say when, someone dies. In any case, none of this helped Elon in becoming more popular. In fact, around the world, people were asking, why is Elon doing a Nazi salute? Something that's actually banned in Germany. But now, of course, the far right praised Elon after this. One of the top neo-Nazi groups said it was Donald Trump's white power moment. Andrew Tate, that Trump supporter that just got released from the Romanian prison, he said we should bring back the Nazi salute. And then Kanye West, I call him Kane. Kanye West said, Elon stole my Nazi swag. Okay. Anyway, so Elon was not winning any popularity contest. And in the middle of all that he gave, this weird, incoherent interview started to make people worry a bit about his competency. I mean, it seemed like something was really wrong with this guy. But then this week happened. Maybe all this could be figured out based on a report that came out this week that Elon had been doing a lot of drugs at the time. Seems Eli was pretty open about it at that time. Now, of course, if you want to take certain drugs in your own private house or your doctor prescribed pills you must take for your health, well, okay, that's fine. But this didn't seem to be that. It seems during the campaign, Elon was taking drugs intensely. It seemed some people from the inner circle of Trump have been letting loose some of this info on the rough drug taking of Elon. He took things like ecstasy and ketamine, psychedelic mushrooms. Now, like I said, if anyone was doing this kind of thing, it's not really our business. But Elon was making decisions that were literally changing people's lives. There have been some times where he had some extremely erratic behavior. Was that because he was just a weirdo or because he had all those drugs in his system? According to the report, Elon's drug consumption went way beyond just recreational use. People said that he was always traveling with a box of around 20 pills, including Adderall, which is a stimulant. You take the downers to get high, but then you take the uppers to get back down. Now, we remember that Elon repeatedly had clashes in the cabinet meetings, and at one point he even had a physical altercation with a cabinet official. They got into like some kind of shoving match. Now, Elon has disputed all these claims as propaganda, but in the past, he has talked pretty openly about his drug use. But in any case, Elon's getting out of the White House. This week, he had one of those weird moments in the White House with Donald Trump to break the news to everyone. They still seem to be the best pals. However, Elon has clearly shown his disapproval of the things Trump has been doing, especially in regards to that latest big, beautiful bill Trump has been pushing. But Trump didn't do what he usually does when somebody criticizes him, then quits. Usually he comes up with a nickname for them and then claims how stupid and incompetent they are. But Elon donated $250 million to his campaign and really pushed for him to be president. Trump doesn't seem to want to cut off the hand that feeds him. So for now, Elon's going to be back at work at Tesla. His time in the White House has been deemed by many as a complete failure. The amount he saved the U.S. was not even close to $2 trillion, and the enemies he made along the way were many. So Elon will head back to Tesla and SpaceX, his brand somewhat tarnished from his time with Trump. But so far, has anyone ever worked with Trump and came out looking good? I'm just saying, this is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam on 𝗪𝗪𝗋 and Radio Bandito TV. I want to talk a little this week about Harvard University. You know, there's this show that I watch called Suits. It's one of my favorite shows ever. You can't even be a lawyer in that firm on that show unless you went to Harvard. It is the elite of the elite, arguably the most difficult school to get into in the world, because once you graduate, you get a Harvard diploma, and that is power. To walk into a job interview with a Harvard diploma means you have the job before you walked in, and now you will decide if the company is worthy of you. But this kind of elitism that Harvard graduates is the kind of thing that Donald Trump and his followers hate. The highly educated, big city elitists. Most of the people in Trump's MAGA circle are from rural areas. They maybe went to high school, possibly a technical school. Now, not all of them, but if you did a survey of hardcore MAGA folks, that would generally be the type. They tend to revere the Harvard types because, well, it's those people that tend to look down on him. Now, intensely enough, that group of people tend to also be the religious right. The Christians, not the Catholics, not the Jews or anything else, the Christians. As my mother used to call them, the Bible thumpers. Basically, if you don't believe as we do, you're going to hell. I actually grew up in one of these areas. Now, why do I bring this up? All right, Trump has picked a fight with Harvard. And the reason for the fight is that Trump says that they are protecting the rights of a certain group of students. That Trump is protecting, most notably, the Jewish students. Now, I know that many have said that Trump really doesn't care either way, that his attack on Harvard is just a way of staying in the headlines for that week, and the next week he'll be on to something else. And there's some truth to that. But the actual reason Trump is giving for his attacks is that Harvard, one of the most diverse colleges in the world, is not standing up for his students' religious rights. So, I'll give everybody a chance to shake their head for a moment. Kind of corresponds to Trump's relentless pursuit of foreign students he doesn't like that protest him, especially on the war in Gaza. As we remember, Trump has been trying to deport as many Muslim students as he can get his hands on. I say Muslim students, but what the Trump administration says is students that do not adhere or agree with the Trump administration's policies on Israel. That is, if you protest the killing of Palestinians, then you are against the policies of Trump administration and that you can no longer have a student visa. What Trump wants from Harvard is all the records on Harvard students that may fall into that category. Basically, it would mean that Harvard would need to hand over private information on all of its students and thus give Trump a chance to track down those students and deport them. Well, Harvard said no. So then Trump said, well, you also have to give way to audits about who you're hiring and what you are teaching. In other words, no more of this DEI hires, being able to hire based on ethnicity, etc. And we must know if you are teaching any classes that does not conform to the ideals of the Trump administration. Again, Harvard said no. We are not doing that. Trump said, if you don't do that, then we won't give you any more federal funds, nor any more federally funded contracts. Harvard said, we still aren't going to do that. So Trump froze more than $2.2 billion in grants and $60 million in contracts. Also threatened Harvard to take away its tax-exempt status. They also said that if Harvard doesn't give information on every international student, it will lose its student and exchange visitor program certification. That means no more international students can go to Harvard. So Harvard filed a lawsuit saying that they have complied with all the laws concerning its students with F-1 visas. And then it all started. Harvard began receiving grant terminations, including those from the National Institutes of Health. So all the current medical research being done at Harvard, where many medical discoveries are made every day, have all been pulled. The U.S. Department of Agriculture terminated its grants. So all the research being done on food growing crops, all pulled. U.S. Department of Energy, Defense, Science, Housing, Urban Development, all canceled all grants at Harvard. Now, Harvard knows that much of this is illegal, these congressional approved grants, and Harvard is winning most of their lawsuits. So, what's Trump going to do? Well, Trump pulled out the big guns. He threatened to revoke all the visas for every international student, period. He announced that every international student needs to either transfer schools or leave the country, and that Harvard can no longer enroll international students at all. Well, that was kind of the last straw. A hearing happened last Thursday to see if Trump can actually do this. Well, the showdown hearing happened, and well, Harvard got the upper hand in this one. The judge ruled that there would be indefinitely a halt to the Trump ordering banning international students from going to school there. So currently now, there is a court order in place not allowing the Trump administration to do this now. This is not including the current court battle over the $2.2 billion that Trump is holding up. Trump said that he wants to give all that money to trade schools, which of course his base of supporters loves to hear. However, is that even going to be legal? My guess is no. I have a feeling that when this gets to court, it will also get shot down. So for right now, I guess Harvard can maintain the status quo. Harvard also argued last week the administration's decision to drop the school from the Department of Homeland Security Student Exchange Visitors Program violated the law. The judge said the court order is very clear that this is not legal. Now, will there be an appeal? 7,000 Harvard students are now very uncertain. The school year just ended. Should the foreign student try and enroll for the next year? Should they travel to their countries to visit their parents and the chance that they might not be able to come back? It's up in the air right now what will happen. Now, the Harvard lawyers, in this case, asked the judge to make sure that this order was written in such a way that the Trump people can't bend its meaning. Now, of course, as you can imagine, Trump is also going after the law firm that's arguing this case for Harvard. Also, there's an issue of upcoming visas for foreign students and how those will be handled. These are the people that are about to go to school there, that are applying now. The way the administration explains it is you get into school, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a visa. And even if you do get a visa, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a visa for all 4 years that you're in school. But in this whole mess, we still don't have proof that the school is a racist, as Trump suggests. It means that if you get on the wrong side of Trump or defy him, no matter what, he will seek revenge on you. Many were saying that this is all because of his son Barron, who didn't get accepted to Harvard. However, the White House has said actually he did not apply. But this fight raises questions about how the laws are followed in the U.S. Can a president just do anything he wants if he doesn't like you? Harvard could have just given in to his demands. I mean, they didn't know if they were going to win this case, just like they don't know for sure they're going to ever get their $2.2 billion in grants. The court could rule against Trump, and then he could just appeal again, or just ignore the court. Harvard Law School may have good lawyers, but going up against Trump doesn't mean that you'll always follow the law. And this is Eric Lecain, here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and Radio Bandito, bringing you stories from around the world. DNA testing. It's the latest in modern identification. You swab your inner cheek and you can tell so much about yourself. You can tell whether your father is really your father. I mean, in case you're unsure. But mostly people like to know where they are from. If they have any distant relatives, where does your family come from? But what about using it for a different reason? What is interesting is if, let's say, you're in your boyfriend's bathroom and you find a hair that's not yours, you can track down where that hair might have come from. Or at least you can find out who the relatives are of the person whose hair it is. That's a new way of catching someone, isn't it? I remember a story I did a while back about a crime spree that happened in California in the 70s and 80s. One guy killed 13 people, had something like 50 rapes. He was known as the Golden State Killer. Police never could seem to catch him. So in 2018, some detectives decided to take some of the evidence that was kept from the crime scene, had DNA on it. They took the DNA codes and they uploaded them to GED Match. It's a public genealogy database that allows users to upload their genetic data to find relatives and build family trees. By comparing the DNA samples to those in the database, investigators identified relatives of the Golden State Killer and, using traditional genealogical research, constructed a family tree to trace potential suspects. Well, in the family tree, one of those people stuck out. A police officer. They finally tracked him down. There was nothing he could say. The DNA was irrefutable. He ended up pleading guilty to 13 counts of murder, got a life sentence. This kind of thing is happening more and more. But as with anything like this, someone's bound to abuse it. I mean, what if the government started pre-testing you for the possibility of a crime that you may commit in the future? And this is where our story begins. Should the police, or more exactly the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, be able to swab children of migrants for DNA in order to track down crimes that they will commit later as adults? I find this story fascinating. This week we learned that the U.S. government has been collecting DNA on migrant children and teenagers, about 133,000 different DNA samples. And they uploaded those samples into the National Crime Database. The database used to catch criminals. It turns out this program has been going on for a while. They believe the total number of cheek swabs that they've done total is like 2.8 million. For the first time I've learned about this U.S. biometric surveillance. been able to tag foreigners coming into the country using their DNA. It turns out some of the people tested are as young as 4 years old. Department of Justice has argued that this kind of testing needs to be done. It's an assessment of the danger of a migrant and how he could potentially pose danger to the public in the future. That this will help solve crimes that migrants will commit down the road of their life. The name of this database is called the CODIS, or the Combined DNA Index System. The database is administered by the FBI and is used by local, state, and federal enforcement agencies to match DNA collected at crime scenes. The issues many are having with this process is that the DNA samples that you give can tell the age of the person. And the Border Patrol has been swabbing a lot more children than anybody really thought before. In fact, they're even swabbing children that are American citizens, mostly age 14 to 17. So should those be put in the database as well? This is where immigration experts are saying that this may not be illegal. If it is, well, it's very troubling. In fact, a lawyer for the Civil Liberties Union said, "This is horribly dystopian." She said, "It's impossible for me to think of a reason to collect a 4-year-old's DNA and upload it to a database that explicitly supposed to be about criminal activity." So the way I understand this is that the CBP and ICE, they operate under the Department of Homeland Security and under current policies are authorized to collect fingerprints and DNA from anyone in their custody as young as 14 years old. Exceptions for younger children can be made in certain cases involving potentially criminal situations. However, the CBP data analyzed says this was the case in as few as 2.2% of hundreds of kids subjected to these DNA swabs. Now, it's a law. You should only be in the criminal database if you are indeed a criminal. So the big question is, in the eyes of Homeland Security, if you are an immigrant, you are also a criminal and should be put into the database? I mean, if you've never committed a crime, you were just put in the database for criminals just because you're from out of the country? Now, an expert in genomics policy and principal investigator for the Genetics and Justice Laboratory said something of the effect of, "This is a very useful tool for tracking down criminals. They take the sample and run it through the database, and if you have been arrested before or convicted of crime, your name will pop up." But what if you have never been accused or convicted of a crime and the Border Patrol swabbed you and put your name in that database? Should you stay in that database if you've never been convicted of a crime? She said, "It's not a fair system to keep DNA of people who have not committed crimes only on the assumption that they might likely commit a crime." The Director of Research and Advocacy for the Center of Privacy and Technology in Georgetown said, the implication is clear. The U.S. government is treating every person who crosses the border, regardless of age, legal status, or where they're accused of doing something wrong, as a possible suspect in a crime that hasn't even occurred yet. I mean, if you're 4 years old, should you be put in the database of criminals in the idea that, well, you're an immigrant, so eventually you're going to be a criminal? Now, as we said before, there's no link to say that migrants commit any more crimes than U.S. citizens. In fact, there are statistics to show that it's actually way less. So, is the technology getting so good that it's able to tell who's going to be a criminal? The U.S. Department of Homeland Security says we need the tech, so we have the tech really, so why not use it? But can you see the possible problems here? I mean, for one, if you wanted to commit a crime and frame it on the yard worker from Mexico, all you need is a strand of his hair. I like the idea of being able to see, the area of the world I come from, but I'm not sure I would want it to be in the National Criminal Database. Something a little uneasy about that. And we're nearly at the end of our show. Thank you so much for joining us here on the World News Jam on DZRJ Radio and Radio Bandito TV. Hope you will be joining us next week here on the Jam for more interesting news stories going on around the world. So for now, this is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam. Everyone be safe out there, and we will see you again next week.
The views and comments of the hosts and guests are not necessarily those of the station.